We talk about government debt all the time, right? It feels like this permanent, just massive feature of our world. But have you ever really stopped and wondered, where did this whole system, this idea of countries borrowing huge sums of money actually come from? Well, the answer is a pretty amazing detective story. But before we get into that, let's just get a sense of the scale we're talking about today. According to the IMF, global public debt is now sitting at about 90% of global GDP. Just think about that. That is an absolutely staggering figure, kind of like a ghost in the financial machine that touches pretty much everything. So, that leads us right to the central mystery we're unpacking here. Where did it all start? You might think Washington, maybe London, or even Beijing in more recent times. But nope, the original blueprint was drawn up somewhere much, much more surprising, centuries ago. That's right, to find the origin story of modern government debt, we have to go back in time. Way back to medieval Venice, a city of canals, commerce, and, as it turns out, financial innovation. It's pretty wild to think about, but historical records are clear on this. The Republic of Venice created the very first thing that we would recognize today as a sovereign debt market, and they did it all the way back in the late 1200s. So, how on earth did this happen? Well, it all started with a classic government problem. Venice was constantly fighting expensive wars to protect its trade routes. So their solution was pretty bold. They forced their wealthy citizens to lend the government money. These were called prestiti. But here is where the real genius kicks in. The claims on these loans weren't just stuck with the original lender, they became tradable. You could actually sell your claim to someone else. And just like that, the world's first secondary market for government debt was born. And get this for a final innovation, these loans were just entries in a book. There were no paper certificates. Venice basically invented paperless debt, or dematerialization, centuries before we even had computers. But, with any financial system, then or now, the official story, the one neatly written down in the ledgers, that was never the whole story. There was this entire hidden world of workarounds and informal deals happening just below the surface. So on paper, a loan was a loan, a contract was a contract, simple. But the reality, historians call it a Baroque economy, ornate, super complex, and just full of hidden alleyways. The historian J.E. Shaw puts it perfectly. He says people back then were very aware of this potential discrepancy between surface form and underlying substance. In other words, everybody knew that what was written down on paper might have very little to do with what was actually going on. And one of the most popular workarounds was this brilliant piece of financial theater called the stacco. It was a really clever way to get around the strict laws at the time against charging interest, which was called usury. Basically, you'd disguise a loan as a sale of goods at a ridiculously inflated price. Let me just walk you through how this worked, because it's fascinating. Say you need cash. A lender comes to you and says, "Look, I can't give you an interest-bearing loan, that's illegal, but I can sell you these beautiful Cairene carpets on credit for 60 ducats. You agree, and you sign the debt note for 60 ducats, even though you never actually see the carpets. Then the lender's guy immediately goes and sells those same carpets for what they're actually worth, let's say 37 ducats, and he hands you that cash. Now here's the catch. You only got 37 ducats in your hand, but legally you are on the hook for the full 60. That 23 ducat difference, that, my friend, is the lender's hidden illegal interest payment. Pretty clever, huh? All of this activity created what you could call a hidden transcript of what was really happening. I mean, you had notaries staging fake handoffs of money bags just for show in front of witnesses, and those witnesses, they were often just servants who had no clue what was in the contract they were witnessing. But debtors were clever too. They'd sometimes go to another notary and file a secret protest, creating their own hidden record of the fraud just in case they wanted to fight it in court later. They even rolled old interest payments into new loans, a practice they literally called usury upon usury. Okay, so that's the Venetian blueprint and its hidden ghosts. It's a fascinating story, right? But why does any of this 800-year-old history matter today? Well, because that idea of a hidden transcript, that gap between the official rules and what's really happening, it echoes through finance even now. Think off-balance sheet accounting or shadow banking. And the system that Venice invented now faces some really big modern challenges. The first and most obvious challenge is just the sheer amount of debt out there. It is rising, and it is rising fast, especially since the pandemic. Now, what's really striking here is the trajectory. That red line shows global public debt. Before the pandemic, it was already pretty high, but look at where it's projected to go by 2030. It's on track to hit nearly 100% of global GDP. And if we break that down a little, we can see who's really driving this train. Those yellow and red lines you see there, that's the United States and China. A huge chunk of this recent debt explosion is coming from the world's two biggest economies. And, you can draw a perfectly straight line from then to now. The reasons for all this borrowing are actually remarkably similar. Venice needed cash to fund its navy and protect its commercial empire. Today, countries need it for things like pandemic recovery, defense, and critical investments in infrastructure and technology. Now, the second major challenge is that the price of all this borrowing is going up. That decade-plus-long era of near-zero interest rates that we all got used to, well, it's over. So let's put all the pieces of this puzzle together. You've got skyrocketing debt levels, now you've got higher interest rates, making that debt way more expensive to pay back. This is creating a genuine crisis, pushing about half of all low-income countries into or near what's called debt distress. And to make things even trickier, the buyers of last resort, the world's big central banks, they're stepping back. They're not buying up government bonds like they used to, which raises a massive looming question. With all this new debt being issued, who is actually going to buy it? And this brings us to a huge trillion-dollar question for the future of the entire global financial system, and it's playing out right now, particularly in Europe. For all its economic power, the Eurozone has a kind of structural flaw. It doesn't have one single, unified, safe asset that global investors can all pile into when things get rocky, the way they do with US Treasury bonds. Now, Europe is trying to fix this. They've started issuing common EU bonds, and you can see they're making real progress. The gap in borrowing costs, what insiders call the spread, between the EU and Germany, which is the Eurozone's safest borrower, it's gotten a lot smaller. But, as you can see, a gap definitely still remains. And as Paolo Angelini from the Bank of Italy points out, closing that final gap, creating a true rival to the US Treasury bond, well, that isn't just a technical problem. It would demand a bold political step. It's about a shared political vision for Europe's economic future. Which leaves us with one last question to chew on. Venice gave the world its first blueprint for government debt, a system that came with its own hidden ghosts and workarounds. Today, the world is waiting for the next great financial blueprint. So will it be drawn up in Brussels, finally creating that unified safe asset for the 21st century? Or will the old ghosts, the modern versions of those hidden transcripts, the political divisions, the complex workarounds, will they continue to haunt the machine?